Standing in the kitchen of my tiny rental apartment, watching the clock tick past midnight on March 15th, I felt the familiar sting that had become as predictable as the changing seasons. Another birthday had passed without so much as a text message from the people who brought me into this world. The silence from my parents wasn't shocking anymore, but it still carved out a small piece of my heart each year, leaving behind a hollow space that seemed to grow larger with time. My name is Serafina Caldwell, and for 28 years, I've been trying to understand how a family can selectively forget one child while lavishing attention on another. My brother Dashiell, 3 years younger than me, had never experienced a forgotten birthday in his entire life. Just 2 months ago, our parents had thrown him a celebration that could have rivaled a royal wedding, complete with a rented ballroom, ice sculptures, and a 5-tier cake that probably cost more than my monthly rent. The contrast wasn't subtle. It was a glaring spotlight on the fundamental difference in how my parents, Cordelia and Maximilian Caldwell, viewed their two children. Dashiell was their golden prince, the child who could do no wrong, whose every achievement was celebrated with champagne, and whose every setback was met with unlimited emotional and financial support. I, on the other hand, had learned early in life that my accomplishments would be met with polite acknowledgement at best, and my struggles would be mine to face alone. Growing up in the Caldwell household had been like living in a constant state of emotional whiplash. One moment, I'd witnessed the effusive praise my parents showered on Dashiell for something as simple as getting a B+ on a math test. The next, I'd hand over a report card filled with A's, only to be told that academic success was simply expected of me. Nothing worth celebrating. When Dashiell made the junior varsity tennis team in high school, our parents bought him professional-grade equipment and hired a private coach. When I earned a full scholarship to study biochemistry at Stanford, they mentioned it briefly at a dinner party as an afterthought, spending most of the conversation discussing Dashiell's plans to major in business at a local college. The birthday issue had started 4 years ago. Shortly after I graduated from university, the first time they forgot, I convinced myself it was genuinely an oversight. My mother had called 3 days later, full of apologies, claiming that March had been particularly hectic with her charity work. She'd offered to take me to lunch the following weekend to make up for it, though we never actually went. The second year, the excuse was that my father had been overwhelmed with a major project at his architectural firm. The third year, they blamed their busy social calendar during the spring season. This year, there hadn't even been an excuse, just deafening silence. What made their forgetfulness particularly painful was the elaborate production they made of Dashiell's birthday every January. The planning would begin months in advance, with my mother consulting party planners and my father clearing his schedule weeks ahead of time. They'd rent venues, hire caterers, and invite everyone they knew. Dashiell's 25th birthday party had been covered in the local society pages, complete with professional photographs of our family looking perfectly happy and unified. I'd attended that party, smiled for the cameras, and played the role of the supportive older sister, while internally struggling with the growing realization that I was essentially invisible in my own family. The morning after my forgotten 28th birthday, I sat in my small apartment, drinking coffee from a chipped mug and staring at my reflection in the black screen of my laptop. My apartment was cramped but clean, furnished with pieces I'd collected over the years from thrift stores and clearance sales. Every item told a story of careful budgeting and thoughtful selection, a stark contrast to the effortless luxury of my childhood home, where money had never been a consideration for anything my parents valued. After graduation, I'd taken a position as a research assistant at a biotech company, grateful for steady work, but knowing the salary would barely cover my living expenses. My parents had made it clear that financial support was not something I should expect. They'd paid for my undergraduate education, they pointed out, which was more than many parents did. The implication was that I should be grateful for that much and figure out the rest on my own. Meanwhile, Dashiell lived in a spacious apartment downtown, his rent covered by our parents, along with his car payments, insurance, and a generous monthly allowance that he used to fund his social life and hobbies. I'd accepted this disparity as an unchangeable fact of life, the way some people accept chronic pain or bad weather. It wasn't fair, but fighting it seemed pointless and exhausting. Instead, I focused on building my own life, independent of their approval or support. I worked long hours, lived frugally, and slowly began to establish myself in my field. My research on protein synthesis had started attracting attention from colleagues and industry publications, though my parents remained oblivious to these achievements. The breakthrough in my career had come 18 months ago when I developed a novel approach to enzyme optimization that had significant applications in pharmaceutical manufacturing. A major drug company had licensed my research, providing me with a substantial initial payment and ongoing royalties that transformed my financial situation almost overnight. For the first time in my adult life, I had genuine financial security, but I'd chosen to keep this development completely private. The decision to hide my success hadn't been planned, but it had evolved naturally from years of having my achievements minimized or ignored. When the licensing deal was finalized, my first instinct had been to share the news with my family, to finally have something that might earn their recognition and pride. But as I'd sat in my apartment, phone in hand, I'd realized that their reaction would likely follow the same pattern as always. They'd find a way to diminish it, to redirect the conversation back to Dashiell, or to treat it as something that had been expected all along. So I'd kept quiet, continuing to live in my modest apartment, driving my aging sedan, and maintaining the appearance of struggling financially. The money had gone into investments and savings, accumulating quietly while I watched my family continue their patterns of favoritism and neglect. There was something liberating about having this secret, about knowing that their perception of me as the disappointing daughter who couldn't quite get her life together was so far from reality. My work life had transformed completely with my newfound financial stability. No longer desperate for every paycheck, I'd been able to negotiate better terms with my employer and take on consulting projects that interested me rather than just those that paid the bills. My reputation in the biotech industry had grown steadily, and I'd been invited to speak at conferences and contribute to prestigious journals. My professional network had expanded to include some of the most respected researchers in my field, yet my parents remained entirely unaware of this parallel life I'd built. The contrast between my public and private personas had become increasingly pronounced. At work, I was Dr. Serafina Caldwell, a rising star in biochemical research whose opinions were sought and valued. At family gatherings, I was still the struggling daughter who needed to be seated at the children's table metaphorically, if not literally. During Dashiell's birthday celebration 2 months ago, I'd listened to my father boast about his son's latest business venture, while my mother nodded approvingly, neither of them bothering to ask about my work or my life. Dashiell, to his credit, had never seemed entirely comfortable with the disparity in our treatment, though he'd never explicitly acknowledged it either. He was genuinely kind-hearted and had often tried to include me in conversations or redirect attention toward my accomplishments when our parents were being particularly obvious in their favoritism. But he was also the beneficiary of their bias, and challenging it would have required him to confront some uncomfortable truths about our family dynamics that he seemed reluctant to explore. The morning after my forgotten birthday, I'd made a decision that had been building for months. With the money I'd earned from my research, I'd been quietly looking at property, initially just browsing online listings as a form of escapism. I'd been drawn repeatedly to a particular area in the mountains, about 90 minutes from the city, where small cabins and cottages offered solitude and natural beauty at surprisingly reasonable prices. One property in particular had captured my imagination, a modest 2-bedroom house perched on a hillside with sweeping views of the valley below. The house was nothing grand by my family's standards, but it represented something profound to me. It would be entirely mine, purchased with money I'd earned through my own work, a tangible symbol of the independence I'd been building quietly for years. The listing photos showed weathered cedar siding, large windows that would flood the interior with natural light, and a wraparound porch perfect for morning coffee and evening reflection. The property included several acres of wooded land, offering privacy and the kind of peace I'd been craving. I'd driven up to see the property 3 times over the past few months, each visit strengthening my conviction that this was where I wanted to build the next chapter of my life. The house needed some cosmetic work, but was structurally sound, and the isolation that might have deterred other buyers was exactly what I was seeking. Standing on that hillside, looking out over miles of pristine landscape, I'd felt a sense of belonging that I'd never experienced in my family home or my cramped apartment. The purchase process had been surprisingly straightforward. My improved financial situation meant I could buy the property outright without the complications of mortgage applications or lengthy approval processes. The closing had been scheduled for the week after my birthday, a timing that felt symbolically appropriate. I would officially become a homeowner just days after my family had once again demonstrated their indifference to my existence. In the days leading up to the closing, I'd found myself imagining how different my life would be in just a few short weeks. No more thin walls shared with noisy neighbors, no more compromising on living space or amenities, no more making do with other people's cast-off furniture. I could create exactly the environment I wanted, surround myself with things I chose, and establish routines that reflected my actual priorities rather than my financial limitations. The house would also provide me with the space and solitude I needed to focus on my research without distractions. I'd been developing ideas for several new projects that could potentially be even more lucrative than my previous work, but they required deep concentration and long periods of uninterrupted thinking. The mountain house would offer an ideal environment for this kind of intensive intellectual work, far removed from the demands and complications of city life. More than the practical benefits, though, the house represented emotional freedom. For the first time in my adult life, I would have a space that was completely mine, where I didn't have to perform or pretend or accommodate anyone else's expectations. I could wake up when I wanted, eat what I wanted, work on projects that interested me, and live according to my own values and preferences. The prospect of this independence was both exhilarating and slightly terrifying. My family's reaction to my eventual disappearance from their lives was something I'd been contemplating with mixed feelings. Part of me hoped they would notice and perhaps finally recognize what they'd been taking for granted. Another part of me suspected they might barely register my absence. So accustomed were they to treating me as peripheral to their main concerns. The uncertainty was both painful and liberating. The knowledge that I was about to find out exactly where I stood in their priorities. The closing day had arrived with unexpected spring weather, warm sunshine, and clear skies that felt like a good omen. I'd driven to the title company office in clothes that reflected my actual financial status rather than the struggling persona I'd been maintaining. A well-tailored suit, quality leather shoes, and accessories that whispered rather than shouted their expense. For the first time in months, I'd allowed myself to look prosperous, to present the image of someone whose life was going exactly according to plan. Signing the papers had been a surreal experience. Each signature represented years of hard work, careful planning, and the kind of delayed gratification that my parents had never expected from me. The keys to my new home felt substantial in my hand, heavier somehow than ordinary keys, weighted with significance and possibility. The deed bore my name alone. No co-signers or guarantors needed, proof of an independence I'd achieved entirely through my own efforts. The drive to my new home had been meditative, each mile taking me further from the life I'd been living and closer to the future I'd been quietly constructing. The familiar route through the mountains felt different now that I was traveling it as an owner rather than a visitor. Every landmark took on new meaning. The curve where the city disappeared behind hills, the overlook where the valley first came into view, the final turn onto the narrow road that led to my property. Standing in front of my house for the first time as its owner, I'd felt a profound sense of accomplishment that had nothing to do with anyone else's approval or recognition. This achievement was mine alone, born from years of being underestimated and overlooked, transformed into something tangible and permanent. The afternoon sun illuminated the cedar siding and cast long shadows across the porch, creating a scene that looked like the perfect setting for a new beginning. The first few days in my new home had been a whirlwind of activity, as I'd arranged for utilities, internet service, and the delivery of basic furnishings. I'd chosen pieces that reflected my actual taste rather than my budget constraints, creating spaces that felt both comfortable and sophisticated. The master bedroom faced east toward the sunrise. The living room's large windows framed the mountain vista, and the kitchen opened onto a deck where I could eat breakfast while watching wildlife move through the forest. My work routine had adapted seamlessly to the new environment. The quiet of the mountains provided perfect conditions for deep thinking, and I'd found myself more productive than ever. The research projects I'd been developing were progressing rapidly, and I'd begun preliminary discussions with several companies about potential licensing agreements that could prove even more profitable than my previous success. The isolation that might have bothered someone else felt like a gift after years of feeling invisible while surrounded by people. Here, my solitude was chosen rather than imposed, a sanctuary rather than a punishment. I could work for hours without interruption, take long walks on my property whenever I needed to think, and create exactly the kind of life I'd been yearning for without having to negotiate or compromise with anyone else's preferences. 3 weeks into my new life, I'd been sitting on my deck with morning coffee, watching the sunrise paint the valley in shades of gold and amber, when the idea had struck me. For years, I'd been the invisible daughter, the forgotten child whose achievements went unnoticed and whose struggles were ignored. My family's perception of me as unsuccessful and struggling was so entrenched that they'd never questioned it, never looked beyond the surface I'd been carefully maintaining. The perfect moment to shatter those assumptions had been building for months, and suddenly, I knew exactly how to do it. Social media had always been something I'd used sparingly, mainly to maintain professional connections and occasionally share updates about my research. My family followed my accounts, though they rarely engaged with my posts, treating my online presence with the same casual indifference they showed my actual life. A single photograph, I'd realized, could communicate more than years of trying to explain or defend myself. One carefully chosen image could reveal the truth about my success while simultaneously highlighting their years of neglect and indifference. The contrast between their perception and reality would be impossible to ignore, forcing a confrontation that was long overdue. I'd spent several days considering the exact timing and approach, wanting to maximize the impact while maintaining my own dignity and emotional protection. The house provided the perfect setting, its beauty and obvious value creating a visual statement that would be impossible to misinterpret. The mountain vista, the quality construction, the sense of prosperity and peace all combined to paint a picture of success that would directly contradict everything my family believed about my circumstances. The morning I'd chosen for my revelation had dawned clear and bright, perfect for photography. I'd dressed carefully in clothing that reflected my actual status rather than the struggling image I'd been maintaining, and I'd taken numerous shots of myself on the deck, with the house and mountains providing a stunning backdrop. The final image captured everything I wanted to convey: contentment, success, independence, and the kind of peace that comes from living life on your own terms. The caption had been crafted with equal care, designed to reveal the truth while highlighting the painful context that made it necessary. Got myself a little gift. Celebrating alone conveyed both the magnitude of what I'd accomplished and the isolation that had made it necessary to celebrate by myself. The juxtaposition of success and solitude would force my family to confront their own role in creating this situation. My finger had hovered over the post button for several minutes as I had considered the implications of what I was about to do. Once I shared this image, there would be no going back to the previous dynamic. My secret would be revealed. My carefully maintained facade would crumble, and my family would be forced to acknowledge that their neglected daughter had been far more successful than they'd ever imagined. The conversation that followed would likely be difficult and potentially painful, but it was also necessary and long overdue. Taking a deep breath, I'd pressed the button and watched as the post went live, instantly visible to my family and professional network alike. The image showed me relaxing on a beautiful deck, mountains stretching endlessly behind me, wearing clothes that clearly hadn't come from discount stores, with an expression of genuine contentment I hadn't felt in years. Within minutes, likes and comments had begun appearing from colleagues and acquaintances, many expressing surprise and admiration at what was clearly an impressive property. The waiting had been the hardest part. I'd known it would take time for my family to see the post, time for the implications to sink in, and time for them to decide how to respond. I'd busied myself with unpacking boxes and arranging furniture, but my attention kept returning to my phone, checking for reactions that would inevitably come but might take hours or even days to appear. My professional contacts had been uniformly positive in their responses, with several colleagues commenting on the beautiful location and asking about my new home office setup. Dr. Elena Marchetti, a researcher I'd collaborated with on several projects, had written that the house looked like the perfect retreat for serious scientific work. Others had made similar observations, treating my obvious prosperity as a natural result of my professional success rather than something shocking or unexpected. The contrast with my family's likely reaction couldn't have been starker. While my professional peers saw success as something I'd earned through my accomplishments, my family had been operating under the assumption that I was barely scraping by, struggling to make ends meet in my tiny apartment while they supported their golden child Dashiell through his latest endeavors. That assumption had been reinforced by years of careful performance on my part. Every family gathering, I'd arrived in modest clothing, driving my aging car, carrying small contributions to potluck dinners that suggested careful budgeting. I'd listened to their discussions of expensive vacations and luxury purchases with what appeared to be wistful resignation, playing the role of the family member who couldn't afford such extravagances. When they had offered small tokens of financial help, I'd accepted graciously, maintaining the illusion that their modest gestures were meaningful to someone in my supposed circumstances. The performance had been exhausting but necessary, protecting me from their expectations and judgments while allowing me to build my real life in private. They'd never question my claims about struggling finances because it fit their preconceived notions about my capabilities and prospects. The smart daughter who'd earned academic honors was somehow also the impractical daughter who couldn't translate her education into financial success, a contradiction they'd accepted without examination because it supported their preferred narrative. Dashiell's financial dependence on our parents had been treated as temporary and understandable, a young man finding his way in the world with appropriate family support. My supposed struggles had been viewed as character flaws, evidence of poor decision-making or unrealistic expectations about adult life. The disparity in these interpretations had been glaring, but never explicitly acknowledged. Just another example of the double standards that had defined my relationship with my parents for as long as I could remember. The evening of my social media revelation, I'd prepared dinner in my new kitchen, a space that perfectly reflected my actual taste and financial situation. Quality appliances, custom cabinetry, and carefully chosen details created an environment that was both functional and beautiful, a far cry from the cramped galley kitchen of my old apartment where I had made do with hand me down appliances and mismatched dishes. As I'd cooked, I'd thought about all the family dinners where I had been subtly excluded from conversations about home renovations, investment strategies, or vacation planning, because such topics were assumed to be beyond my means or interest. My parents had discussed Dashiell's apartment upgrades and furniture purchases in detail while barely acknowledging my living situation, treating my modest circumstances as either embarrassing or irrelevant to family discussions. The mountain silence had been profound as I had eaten dinner on my deck, watching the sun set behind distant peaks. No traffic noise, no neighbors arguing through thin walls, no compromise required with anyone else's schedule or preferences. The solitude that might have felt lonely in other circumstances felt like profound luxury after years of feeling isolated, despite being surrounded by family members who barely saw me as fully present. My phone had remained relatively quiet throughout the evening, though I'd noticed increased activity on my post as more people discovered and responded to the image. Professional contacts continued to offer congratulations and admiration, while acquaintances from university and other contexts expressed pleasant surprise at what was clearly a significant life upgrade from what they had known about my circumstances. The first family response had come from an unexpected source. My Aunt Cordelia, my mother's younger sister, who'd always maintained a somewhat distant relationship with our immediate family, had commented with a simple but loaded message. "Absolutely stunning, Serafina. You must be so proud of what you've accomplished." The comment had felt like vindication from someone who'd observed our family dynamics from the outside and perhaps noticed things that others had chosen to ignore. Aunt Cordelia had always been different from the rest of my mother's family, more independent and less concerned with social expectations or appearances. She'd built a successful career in art curation, never married, and lived life according to her own priorities rather than traditional expectations. During my childhood, she'd been the relative most likely to ask about my interests and achievements, though her geographic distance had limited our interactions to occasional holidays and brief visits. Her comment had been followed by a private message that had made my throat tight with unexpected emotion. "I've watched your parents overlook your achievements for years, sweetheart. This house is beautiful, and you deserve every bit of happiness and success you've found. Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise." The validation from someone who'd observed our family patterns had been more meaningful than I had anticipated. Confirmation that my perceptions hadn't been skewed by hurt feelings or unrealistic expectations. By the time I'd gone to bed that first night, my post had accumulated dozens of reactions, almost exclusively positive, with only my immediate family remaining notably silent. The contrast was telling, highlighting how different my professional and social networks were from the family that had shaped my early understanding of my own worth and capabilities. Outside my family's influence, my success was seen as admirable and well-deserved rather than surprising or questionable. The second day had brought more professional recognition, with several colleagues reaching out privately to discuss potential collaborations or consulting opportunities now that I had what appeared to be an ideal setup for intensive research work. Dr. James Rothschild, A department head at a major pharmaceutical company had sent a lengthy message about a project that would benefit from my expertise and could be conducted remotely from my mountain location. These responses had reinforced something I'd begun to understand more clearly since achieving financial independence. My professional value had never been in question among people who actually knew my work. The self-doubt and insecurity I'd carried for years had been products of my family environment rather than accurate reflections of my capabilities or prospects. Outside that environment, I was respected and sought after, my opinions valued, and my contributions recognized. The contrast between these two realities had been particularly stark as I'd worked in my new home office, a space I'd designed specifically for the kind of intensive research that had become my specialty. Large windows provided natural light and inspiring views, while custom-built shelving held my reference materials and equipment. The desk was positioned to take advantage of both the view and optimal lighting conditions, creating an environment that supported rather than hindered my productivity. My old apartment's makeshift work area had been a constant reminder of compromise and limitation squeezed into whatever space wasn't needed for basic living functions. Here, my work had its own dedicated space, properly equipped and beautifully appointed, reflecting the reality of my professional status rather than the fiction I'd been maintaining for family consumption. The third day had finally brought the family response I'd been anticipating and dreading in equal measure. My mother's comment had appeared mid-afternoon, carefully worded but heavy with implications. What a lovely surprise, Serafina. We had no idea you'd been doing so well. Would love to catch up soon. The politeness couldn't quite mask the underlying shock and perhaps embarrassment at having so completely misjudged their daughter's circumstances. Within hours, my father had added his own comment, slightly more direct. Impressive property, honey. Looking forward to hearing about this exciting development in your life. The subtext was clear. They expected explanations, wanted to understand how their struggling daughter had suddenly revealed herself to be prosperous enough to purchase what was obviously valuable real estate. Dashiell's response had been the most genuine and immediate. "Holy shit, Sarah, this place is incredible. I can't believe you've been keeping this secret. I'm so proud of you and can't wait to see it in person." His enthusiasm had felt real rather than calculated, expressing the kind of brotherly pride I'd rarely experienced, but had always hoped was possible between us. The private messages had begun arriving shortly after the public comments, each family member clearly wanting to understand the situation without exposing their own ignorance or surprise publicly. My mother's message had been the longest and most complex, full of apologies for being out of touch and expressions of excitement about my apparent success, carefully avoiding any acknowledgement of the years of neglect that had made such secrecy necessary. My father's private communication had been more direct and businesslike, asking specific questions about my financing and professional situation that revealed his assumption that some kind of windfall or inheritance must have made the purchase possible. The idea that his daughter might have earned such prosperity through her own work seemed beyond his immediate consideration, despite knowing about my education and career. Reading these messages in my beautiful new home, surrounded by evidence of the success I had achieved independently, I'd felt a complex mixture of emotions, Vindication, certainly, that my family was finally forced to confront their misconceptions about my life and capabilities. Sadness that it had taken such a dramatic revelation to get their attention and recognition. Anger that years of achievements had been dismissed or ignored while they'd focused entirely on supporting and celebrating my brother. But also, unexpectedly, a sense of protection over the life I'd built in secret. Their sudden interest felt intrusive rather than welcome, a desire to be included in something they'd played no role in creating. The independence I'd fought for and earned seemed suddenly vulnerable to their involvement and opinions, their need to understand and categorize what I'd accomplished. The mountain house represented more than financial success or comfortable living arrangements. It symbolized years of persistence in the face of indifference, proof that their neglect hadn't broken my spirit or limited my potential. Every carefully chosen detail, from the handcrafted tiles in the bathroom to the custom bookshelves in my office, represented choices made without having to consider anyone else's preferences or budget constraints. More importantly, the house represented emotional freedom from their expectations and judgments. Here, I didn't have to perform the role of the struggling daughter or accept their version of my story. I could simply be myself, pursuing work that fascinated me, living according to my own values, and building the kind of life that brought me genuine satisfaction rather than grudging approval from people who'd never really seen me clearly. The fourth day had brought more family communications, increasingly urgent in their desire to arrange meetings and conversations. My mother had called twice, leaving voicemails that grew progressively more emotional as she processed the implications of what my success meant about their assumptions and behavior. My father had sent multiple text messages, his initial business-like curiosity evolving into something closer to paternal pride, though years too late to feel entirely genuine. Dashiell had been the most persistent, sending a stream of messages that ranged from excited congratulations to curious questions about my work and financial situation. His communications felt the most genuine, lacking the careful political calculations I sensed in our parents' responses. He seemed genuinely happy for my success, while also confused about why I'd felt the need to keep it secret, a reaction that suggested he might be more aware of our family dynamics than I'd previously assumed. The professional world had continued to respond positively, with several new opportunities emerging as colleagues learned about my change in circumstances. The mountain location, rather than being seen as isolating, was viewed as an ideal setup for the kind of focused research work that was increasingly difficult to conduct in urban environments full of distractions and interruptions. Dr. Marchetti had followed up her initial comment with a detailed proposal for a collaboration that could take advantage of my new setup, suggesting that we co-author a paper on protein synthesis optimization that would benefit from extended periods of intensive work. Other colleagues had made similar overtures, treating my revealed prosperity as confirmation of professional success rather than something requiring explanation or justification. The contrast between these professional responses and my family's shocked confusion had highlighted the different ways my two worlds viewed achievement and independence. In my professional life, success was expected and celebrated, seen as the natural result of hard work and capability. In my family, success seemed to require explanation and justification, especially when it came from the child they'd written off as impractical and struggling. As I'd prepared for what I knew would be an inevitable confrontation with my parents, I'd found myself thinking about the years of small humiliations and casual dismissals that had led to this moment. The birthday celebrations they'd attended for Dashiell while forgetting mine entirely. The financial support they'd provided him while assuming I should be grateful for basic educational expenses. The conversations about family finances and investments that excluded me, not because I lacked interest or knowledge, but because they assumed I had nothing to contribute. Each memory had reinforced my conviction that revealing my success this way had been necessary rather than vindictive. They'd created the conditions that made secrecy protective, then acted surprised when their neglected daughter had developed a life they knew nothing about. The dramatic revelation forced them to confront not just their misconceptions about my circumstances, but their own role in creating the distance that had made such misconceptions possible. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting my deck in shades of gold and amber, when my phone finally rang with the call I'd been expecting. My mother's name appeared on the screen, and I knew that the conversation I'd been preparing for was about to begin. The first phase of my revelation was complete. The secret was out, and now I would have to navigate the complex emotions and difficult conversations that would determine whether this dramatic disclosure would lead to genuine healing or simply create new forms of family dysfunction. I let the phone ring twice before answering, using those moments to center myself in the reality of what I'd accomplished and the strength I'd developed through years of being underestimated. Whatever came next, I would face it from this position of genuine independence, no longer the struggling daughter seeking approval, but a successful woman who had built the life she wanted, despite their indifference. The conversation that was about to begin would reveal whether my family was capable of seeing and accepting who I had actually become, or whether the patterns that had defined our relationships were too entrenched to change. "Serafina?" My mother's voice came through the phone with an unfamiliar breathlessness, as if she'd been running or holding her breath. "Honey, I saw your post. That house is absolutely beautiful. I had no idea you were doing so well." The careful neutrality in her tone told me she was processing shock while trying to maintain her composure. I could picture her in the elegant living room of my childhood home, probably pacing near the massive windows that overlooked their manicured gardens, trying to reconcile the image of her supposedly struggling daughter with the evidence of obvious prosperity she'd just discovered. "Hello, Mother?" I replied, settling into one of the comfortable chairs on my deck, the mountain vista stretching endlessly before me. "Thank you. I'm quite happy with it." "When did you buy it? How long have you been living there? I feel terrible that we haven't been more in touch." The questions tumbled out in a rush that revealed how completely she'd been caught off guard. "Your father and I were just saying how we should have you over for dinner soon. It's been far too long since we've had a proper conversation." The irony wasn't lost on me. After 4 years of forgotten birthdays and casual dismissal, my revealed prosperity had suddenly made me worthy of their attention and dinner invitations. I let the silence stretch for a moment, watching a hawk circle lazily above the valley while I considered how much truth this conversation could bear. "I closed on the property 3 weeks ago," I said finally. "I've been looking at houses up here for several months. The location is perfect for my work, and I wanted something that was entirely mine. Your work? My mother's voice carried a note of confusion. I thought you were still at that research position downtown. Has something changed? This was the moment I'd been both anticipating and dreading, when I would have to decide how much of my carefully guarded reality to reveal. The professional success that had made this house possible wasn't something that had happened overnight, but the result of years of achievements they'd never bothered to notice or understand. My research has been quite successful, I said, choosing my words carefully. I developed some techniques for enzyme optimization that have applications in pharmaceutical manufacturing. A major company licensed my work, and the ongoing royalties have provided me with considerable financial flexibility. The silence that followed was so profound, I wondered if the call had been dropped. When my mother finally spoke, her voice had changed completely, taking on the kind of excited, almost breathless quality I'd only heard her use when discussing Dashiell's accomplishments. Serafina, that's incredible. Why didn't you tell us? We had no idea you were involved in anything so significant. Your father will be amazed. He's always said that biochemistry was such a practical field, but we never imagined you were developing actual products that companies would want to license. The casual revelation that they'd discussed my career choice as practical, while remaining entirely ignorant of my actual achievements, was both hurtful and enlightening. They'd categorized my work as sensible, but unremarkable, never bothering to investigate whether their assumptions bore any relationship to reality. There are several other projects in development that look quite promising, I continued, deciding to fully shatter their misconceptions. I've been consulting with pharmaceutical companies and biotech firms for the past 2 years. The Mountain House will give me the space and quiet I need to focus on the more complex research. 2 years? My mother's voice rose slightly. You've been consulting for 2 years and we didn't know? Serafina, honey, we would have been so proud. We would have celebrated with you. Why didn't you share this wonderful news? The question hung in the air, like an accusation turned back on itself. Why hadn't I shared my success? Why had I chosen to let them continue believing I was struggling while I built a prosperous life in secret? The answer was complicated and painful, rooted in years of being overlooked and undervalued. But perhaps this conversation required that level of honesty. When would I have told you? I asked quietly. During the family dinners I wasn't invited to? The birthday celebrations you forgot? The holiday gatherings where you spent hours discussing Dashiell's latest ventures while barely acknowledging my presence? The directness of my response seemed to shock her into silence again. When she spoke, her voice was smaller, more uncertain than I'd ever heard it. We never meant to exclude you, sweetheart. If we seemed distracted or busy, it wasn't because we weren't interested in your life. We just assumed you would tell us if something important was happening. I graduated summa cum laude from Stanford, I said, letting the full weight of accumulated grievances enter my voice. I published my first research paper in the Journal of Biochemical Engineering when I was 24. I won the Pemberton Award for Innovation in Protein Synthesis when I was 26. I've been invited to speak at conferences in Geneva and Tokyo. None of this was secret information, Mother. You just never asked. Each achievement I listed felt like lifting weights I'd been carrying for years. These accomplishments had shaped my professional identity and earned me respect in my field. Yet, my own family had remained completely oblivious to them. The silence from my mother told me she was finally beginning to understand the magnitude of what she'd overlooked. The Pemberton Award, she repeated slowly. That sounds significant. It's one of the most prestigious recognition in biochemical research, I explained. Recipients are typically established researchers with decades of experience. I was the youngest winner in the award's history. Oh my God, my mother whispered. Serafina, I had no idea. We had no idea. How could we have missed something so important? The answer to that question would require her to confront some uncomfortable truths about their family dynamics, their assumptions about my capabilities, and their single-minded focus on Dashiell's needs and achievements. I waited to see if she was prepared for that level of self-examination. You missed it because you weren't looking, I said gently but firmly. Every conversation we've had for the past 5 years has focused on Dashiell's business ventures, his social life, his apartment, his needs. When I tried to mention my work, you'd change the subject or make polite noises before redirecting the conversation back to him. That's not true, my mother protested, but her voice lacked conviction. We've always been interested in both of your lives equally. 4 birthdays, Mother, I said, letting the hurt I'd been carrying color my words. 4 birthdays you forgot completely while spending months planning elaborate celebrations for Dashiell. If that's your definition of equal treatment, we have very different understandings of the word. The phone went quiet, except for the sound of my mother's breathing. I could hear her struggling with emotions she probably hadn't expected to feel during this conversation. When she spoke again, her voice was thick with what sounded like genuine regret. You're right about the birthdays, she admitted finally. There's no excuse for that. I don't know how we let that happen, but you're absolutely right. That was inexcusable. The acknowledgement felt both validating and inadequate. Years of accumulated hurt couldn't be resolved with a single admission of wrongdoing, but it was more accountability than I'd ever received from either of my parents. I didn't buy this house to punish you, I said, looking out at the peaceful mountain landscape that had become my sanctuary. I bought it because I could afford it, because it's beautiful, and because I wanted to build a life that reflects my actual circumstances rather than your assumptions about them. Can we see it? My mother asked suddenly. Can your father and I come visit? I know we have a lot to make up for, but maybe we could start by understanding this new chapter of your life better. The request surprised me with its directness and apparent sincerity. Part of me wanted to refuse, to protect this space I'd created from the complicated emotions my family brought with them. Another part wondered if genuine healing might be possible if they were willing to confront the reality of who I actually was rather than who they'd assumed me to be. I think that would be good, I heard myself saying, but there need to be some conditions. Of course, whatever you need. This isn't about you getting to see the house, I explained carefully. This is about you getting to know your daughter. If you come up here, I want real conversations about my life, my work, my achievements. I don't want to spend the visit hearing about Dashiell's latest projects or your social calendar. I want you to see who I actually am. Yes, my mother said quickly. Yes, absolutely. That's exactly what we want too. After we ended the call, I sat on my deck as darkness settled over the mountains, processing the conversation and its implications. My mother's shock had seemed genuine, as had her regret about the forgotten birthdays and years of inattention. But whether that recognition would translate into lasting change in our relationship remained to be seen. The next morning brought a text message from my father that was longer and more personal than any communication I'd received from him in years. He acknowledged that they'd failed to understand the significance of my career achievements and admitted that their assumptions about my financial situation had been completely wrong. He asked if he could call me later to discuss my research and business consulting, expressing genuine curiosity about work he'd never bothered to investigate before. Dashiell's response was characteristically more direct. He called while I was having breakfast on the deck, his voice full of excitement and confusion in equal measure. "Sarah, what the hell?" he said without preamble. "I've been lying awake all night, trying to figure out how I missed the fact that my sister is apparently some kind of scientific genius. Mom told me about the Pemberton Award, and I looked it up. Do you realize how incredible that is?" His enthusiasm was infectious and felt more genuine than our parents' carefully measured responses. "I realize it," I said, smiling despite myself. "I just didn't realize you would realize it." "Are you kidding? I've been bragging about you to everyone I know since yesterday. My sister, the biochemist, who won one of the most prestigious awards in her field and bought a mountain house with her licensing royalties. I sound like I'm making it up." The pride in his voice was something I'd rarely heard directed toward me, and it touched something deep in my chest that I'd thought was permanently hardened against disappointment. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his tone growing more serious. "I know Mom and Dad can be complicated, but you could have told me. I would have celebrated with you." The question deserved an honest answer, because celebrating my achievements seemed to require diminishing yours, at least in our family. There was never room for both of us to be successful at the same time. "That's not true," Dashiell protested, but then stopped himself. "Actually, maybe it is true. Maybe that's exactly what happened, and I was too comfortable being the favorite to notice what it was costing you." His acknowledgement of the family dynamics we'd both lived with, but never explicitly discussed, felt like another small breakthrough. Perhaps the revelation of my success would force all of us to examine the patterns that had shaped our relationships. "I'd like to come see the house," he said, "and I'd like to understand your work better. I've been coasting on Mom and Dad's support for too long, and seeing what you've accomplished on your own makes me realize I need to figure out what I'm actually capable of when I'm not being handed everything." The visit from my parents happened the following weekend. They arrived in my father's luxury sedan, looking slightly out of place as they navigated the winding mountain road to my property. I watched from my deck as they parked and took in their first full view of the house and its surroundings, their expressions revealing the extent to which my circumstances had surprised them. My mother was dressed in the kind of casual, elegant outfit she wore to garden club meetings, clearly having made an effort to look appropriate for a mountain visit while maintaining her usual standards. My father wore khakis and a polo shirt that probably cost more than most people's monthly car payments. His businessman's attire adapted for what he apparently considered rustic surroundings. "Serafina," my mother called as she climbed the steps to my deck, "this is absolutely breathtaking. I can't believe you've been keeping this secret." The house tour was both awkward and revealing. My parents moved through the rooms with expressions of genuine admiration, mixed with confusion, as if they couldn't quite reconcile the daughter they thought they knew with evidence of her obvious prosperity and sophisticated taste. Every carefully chosen detail, from the custom lighting fixtures to the high-end appliances, contradicted their assumptions about my circumstances and capabilities. "The kitchen is incredible," my father said, running his hands over the granite countertops and examining the professional-grade appliances. "This is the kind of setup serious cooks dream about. I had no idea you were so interested in culinary pursuits." "I've always enjoyed cooking," I replied, not mentioning that they'd never bothered to notice because they'd never been interested enough in my daily life to observe my hobbies and interests. Having adequate space and proper equipment makes it much more enjoyable. My home office generated the most sustained attention, perhaps because it provided concrete evidence of the professional success they'd failed to recognize. My father examined the specialized equipment I used for certain types of analysis, asking surprisingly informed questions about its applications and cost. My mother studied the framed certificates and awards on the walls, reading each one carefully as if discovering a stranger's accomplishments. "The International Conference on Protein Engineering invited you as a keynote speaker?" my mother asked, her voice carrying a note of amazement. "That's incredible, honey. How many people attend something like that?" "Usually around 1,500 researchers from around the world," I explained. "It's considered one of the most important annual gatherings in the field." "And you never mentioned it," my father said, shaking his head. "A keynote address to 1,500 international experts, and we had no idea it was happening." The conversation over lunch was the most substantive discussion we'd had about my life in years. They asked detailed questions about my research, my consulting work, and my future projects, displaying genuine curiosity and engagement that felt both wonderful and painful. Wonderful because this was the kind of parental interest I'd craved for years. Painful because its absence had shaped so much of my emotional development. "I keep thinking about all the times we could have been celebrating your achievements," my mother said, as we sat on the deck after eating. "The conferences, the awards, the licensing deal, we should have been the people you called first with good news, not the people who found out through social media posts." "Why do you think that changed?" I asked, genuinely curious about their perspective on our family dynamics. "When did you stop asking about my life in detail?" My parents exchanged a look that suggested they'd been discussing this question since our phone conversation. My father cleared his throat before responding. "I think we made assumptions about your independence," he said carefully. "You were always so self-sufficient, so capable of handling whatever came up. Dashiell needed more guidance, more support, so we focused our attention where we thought it was needed most. But independence and success aren't the same thing as not needing recognition or family involvement," I pointed out. "Being capable of handling things alone doesn't mean wanting to handle everything alone." My mother nodded, tears gathering in her eyes. "We interpreted your strength as not needing us, when what you actually needed was for us to see and acknowledge that strength." The insight felt profound and overdue. They'd mistaken my resilience for indifference, my self-reliance for rejection of family connection. Meanwhile, their constant focus on Dashiell's needs had reinforced their belief that he was the child who required their attention and support. The forgotten birthdays weren't about bad memory, my mother admitted quietly. They were about being so focused on Dashiell's needs and schedules that yours became invisible to us. That's inexcusable, and I'm so sorry. The apology felt genuine and necessary, though it couldn't erase the years of feeling forgotten and dismissed. What mattered more was whether this recognition would translate into lasting changes in how we related to each other. Dashiell's visit the following week felt different from our parents' careful, apologetic approach. He arrived with genuine excitement about seeing the house and learning about my work, but also with hard questions about our family dynamics that suggested he'd been doing serious thinking about his own role in them. "I've been going through old family photos," he said, as we walked through the wooded areas of my property, looking at birthday parties, graduations, holiday celebrations. The pattern is pretty obvious once you start paying attention. "What pattern?" I asked, though I suspected I knew what he'd observed. "Every major celebration was about me," he said bluntly. "Even your college graduation party was cut short because I had a tennis tournament the next morning. Your achievements were always mentioned in passing, like footnotes to the main story of my life." The acknowledgement was both painful and liberating. Having someone else recognize the patterns I'd lived with made them feel less like personal failures and more like systemic problems that could potentially be addressed. "I don't think it was malicious," Dashiell continued, "but it was consistent, and it was unfair. I benefited from it without questioning it, which makes me complicit, even if I didn't design it." We spent hours talking about our childhood, our parents' expectations, and the ways their different treatment of us had shaped our relationship with each other and our understanding of our own capabilities. Dashiell admitted that their constant support had sometimes felt more like pressure than encouragement, creating expectations that were difficult to live up to. "I never had to prove myself the way you did," he said. "Everything I accomplished was celebrated, whether it was actually impressive or not. Everything you accomplished was treated as expected, no matter how extraordinary it actually was." The conversation was difficult, but necessary, creating space for us to understand each other as adults rather than the children we'd been when these patterns were established. By the time he left, our relationship felt fundamentally different, built on mutual recognition and respect rather than the complicated dynamics of our childhood. The months that followed brought gradual but significant changes in my family relationships. My parents made genuine efforts to stay informed about my work, asking detailed questions about my research and celebrating my professional achievements with the kind of enthusiasm they'd previously reserved for Dashiell. They remembered my birthday with elaborate attention that felt slightly performative, but sincere in its intent to correct past neglect. More importantly, they began treating my success as something worth understanding rather than something to be amazed by from a distance. My father started reading biochemistry journals to better comprehend my work, while my mother researched the companies I consulted with to understand their significance in the pharmaceutical industry. Dashiell used the wake-up call of my success to examine his own relationship with independence and achievement. He gradually reduced his financial dependence on our parents, found work that challenged him rather than simply providing income, and developed interests and goals that were his own rather than extensions of their expectations. The mountain house became a bridge between my old life and my new reality, a place where family members could visit and genuinely get to know the person I'd become rather than the struggling daughter they'd imagined me to be. The space allowed for conversations that were impossible in the emotionally charged environment of our childhood home, where established patterns and old assumptions dominated every interaction. My professional life continued to flourish, with several new licensing agreements providing additional financial security and opportunities for challenging research projects. The isolation of the mountains proved ideal for the kind of intensive work that had become my specialty, while the beauty of the surroundings provided inspiration and restoration after long days focused on complex problems. But perhaps the most significant change was internal, the way I understood myself and my place in my family. The years of being overlooked and undervalued had taught me to find validation in professional achievement and personal independence, strengths that served me well, but it also created barriers to emotional intimacy and family connection. Living openly as a successful person rather than hiding my achievements allowed me to engage with my family from a position of confidence rather than defensive self-protection. I could celebrate their successes without feeling diminished, offer support without feeling exploited, and maintain boundaries without cutting off connection entirely. The mountain house had been purchased as a gift to myself, a celebration of what I had achieved despite their indifference. But it became something more meaningful, a symbol of the possibility that families could change, that patterns established in childhood could be recognized and revised, and that genuine recognition and respect could develop even after years of misunderstanding and neglect. As I sat on my deck one evening 6 months after my social media revelation, watching the sun set behind the mountains I'd grown to love, I reflected on the unexpected ways my life had changed. The financial independence that had made this house possible was still important, but it was no longer the primary source of my sense of worth and security. Instead, I discovered that the most valuable gift wasn't the house itself, but the conversations it had made possible, the recognition it had forced, and the opportunity it had created for my family to see and appreciate who I had actually become. The forgotten birthdays and years of casual dismissal couldn't be undone, but they could be acknowledged, understood, and used as foundation for building something better. My phone buzzed with a text message from Dashiell, a photo of him at his new job with a caption that made me smile. Following my sister's example and actually earning my achievements. Thanks for showing me what that looks like. The message was followed by another from my mother. Your father and I would love to have you over for dinner Sunday. We want to hear about your latest research project, and we promise the conversation will be all about you for once. Reading these messages in my beautiful mountain retreat, I felt something I'd never quite experienced before. The certainty that I was valued and seen by my family for who I actually was rather than who they needed me to be. It had taken a dramatic revelation and months of difficult conversations to reach this point, but the result felt worth every moment of uncertainty and pain along the way. The sun disappeared behind distant peaks, leaving the sky painted in shades of gold and purple that would never stop taking my breath away. Tomorrow would bring new research challenges, new opportunities, and continued work on rebuilding family relationships that had been damaged by years of misunderstanding and neglect. But tonight, sitting in the home I'd built with my own success, surrounded by evidence of achievements that were finally recognized and celebrated, I felt something that had eluded me for most of my adult life: the deep satisfaction of being known, valued, and loved for exactly who I was.